Open up the questions now for the whole group of speakers. Sadly, Julie had to leave, but there's an opportunity now to really think broadly, and also for the speakers themselves to maybe ask questions and discuss things across the group as well. So, does anybody have any questions to kick off for the panel today? If not, I'd like to start with one. If that's okay. Treadmill running was mentioned by Rich, and also Andy when you did your treadmill tests. So I suppose it's a question that spans two things there. One is how does the data they collect in the lab on a treadmill transfer to what happens in the real world, and how do we kind of control for that? And then I suppose as well on for Rich, advocating treadmill running for runners. Any kind of comments or considerations there in general from a running protection from injury perspective?
Is this on? Yes. Thanks for the question, Charlie. So as I mentioned during my talk, when we do treadmill testing in the lab, we set the gradient to 1%. I did a study for my PhD back in the early 90s where we ran people outdoors and on the treadmill set at different gradients. And of course, when you're running outdoors, you do encounter air resistance. And so if you run on a treadmill at a given speed, the energy cost, the oxygen cost, is a bit less than if you run outdoors at exactly the same speed. So to compensate for that, we use a slight adjustment to the treadmill gradient to make the VO2 and the heart rate and the blood lactate equivalent. 1% works pretty well between about 10 kilometers per hour and 18 kilometers per hour. So that's what's been adopted in most labs, just simplifies things. Technically, what you should do, it should be a little bit of a lower gradient at slower speeds and kind of ramp up. So, by the time you're running at 21 or 22 kilometers per hour, 2% is probably more akin to that. So, but I think it works quite well. So I showed you the data from Jake Smith. So we tested him at 1%. And you take him outdoors and you show his data when he's running in the field in a competitive marathon, and the speeds and the heart rates, remain equivalent, and they fit with what you'd predict he'd be capable of. So in terms of predicting performances from the lab, that does work pretty well, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak from a biomechanical basis. We've done several studies looking at differences between running overground and running on a treadmill. It's far more similar than different. There are a few key differences. As I mentioned, Achilles tendon forces tend to be a little bit higher on a treadmill. Hip forces are a little bit lower, so the hip extensor moment is a little bit lower. So if you have a runner who has some long-standing hip FAI issues or proximal hamstring tendinopathy, a treadmill might be a really good place to do it. And back to the point about the grade part, know that if, like all the data that I showed, where you've got 12 to 14% greater Achilles tendon forces running on a treadmill, know that if you start increasing that grade, that number is going to go up, but because we collected that data with a level treadmill. But yeah, for me, I think with from a rehab standpoint, we use treadmills all the time. I think they're excellent because if you have someone who's recovering from an injury and they have to stop, because they start getting a flare-up in the middle of their return to run program, they just have to step off the treadmill. They're not stuck, a mile, 2 miles from home, where they have the potential to really overdo it. So for me, I think treadmills are great. I think for older runners, I think they work really well and very measured doses. So yeah, it's one of the things that we tend to advocate.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? So you mentioned that for some runners, it might be nice for them to run on a treadmill once a week. My wife and I tend to do the opposite. We do nearly all of our running on a treadmill and only a little bit outdoors. What do you think about that?
I actually do the same. So, yeah, the one thing I would say is the most dangerous piece of equipment in a gym is the treadmill. And so I fell off a treadmill this summer, actually, and got banged up pretty good. But there's that. But I think it's what usually causes running-related injuries are rapid changes in the running profile from your biomechanical load. So if that's what you're used to, I'd be more worried about running outdoors suddenly, like maybe you go on a vacation, you go to the beach or something like that, and you don't have access to a treadmill. You're going to be not loading your plantar flexors as much, but your hip extensors are going to be loaded more, so you may be at greater risk for like a proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So it's that rapid change that really seems to be the most important. It's not so much what you're doing habitually. Yeah, great question.
Great. Question at the back.
we've seen the sub 2 hour marathon in a control, and we've recently seen Kipchoge beat set a new world record. Do you think it's possible we're going to see a sub 2 hour in a real race scenario, and how far away, and maybe how do you think that might occur?
I think we definitely will see it. Exactly when it'll happen, I don't know. It would be nice if it was going to be Elliot, but you know, he can't have too many, surely, great races left in him. But if you think, you know, so it's gone now from 2:02:57 to 2:01:09 in the matter of 5 years or something like that. It doesn't take much to think that something equivalent could happen again. I think what we saw in Berlin last weekend, you know, Elliot went through halfway in 59:51 or something like that, felt that he could go sub 2, but he didn't have anybody with him in the last half. Now, if you had good conditions like they had last weekend in Berlin, and you had a properly competitive field, if there were more people in the world who could keep up with him for longer, and they could draft him, that's the important thing. It's not so much the competition, it's the fact that if they shared the drafting, I've mentioned air resistance already, but it makes a big difference. It's probably worth 90 seconds. So if he had people that he could race against for 25 miles, he probably would have gone under. I think getting the pacing right, he got a bit too carried away last weekend, I think. You know, I think if he'd gone through in 60:30, he'd have been even closer to the 2 hour barrier last weekend. I don't know if anybody else has comments.
It's more of a question. What's the female equivalent, and when are you going to do that?
We've actually already published a paper on that, Joyner, Hunter and myself, where we argued that Paula Radcliffe's 2:15:25 was already equivalent to a sub 2 hour for men. It's just unfortunate that, you know, breaking 2:15, which has now happened, you know, doesn't sound so good as breaking 2 hours. It's like the 4-minute mile. It's really unfortunate. I know Nike are looking for something equivalent for women, but if you can think of one, let us know.
Can I ask just another one about the kind of optimal dose of exercise? Sanjay, you've talked a lot about endurance exercise, the number of minutes of exercise. Given that the masters athlete needs to, it seems, focus more on strength alongside endurance, how does that affect cardiovascular health and physiology?
Yeah, I mean, I must say that most cardiovascular studies in athletes looking at certainly cardiovascular morbidity and mortality are focused predominantly on moderate continuous exercise or high intensity interval training. They haven't really looked at the effect, well, they have looked at the effect of strength training, but they've not been able to show the benefits, certainly cardiovascular benefits of strength training compared. There is some, but not as much as moderate continuous training. But as we've heard, you know, as one gets older, strength training is very, very important. And I can speak from my own experience. You know, I was saying to someone, I don't think I'll ever run again because I'm very worried about this patellofemoral area. And it started, you know, when I hit my 50s, and I didn't have any problems before that. So, we need to focus on strength. But in terms of cardiovascular benefits, I think most of the studies have been based around moderate continuous training.
Another question in the middle here, and then I think there's a couple more after that. I've got you there.
I think this was alluded to earlier with young athletes and developing issues later on with as a masters athlete. Are there any studies to suggest that strength training while you're younger reduces the rate of decline of your sarcopenia and all the other, your tendon elasticity?
So the question is, does strength training reduce the rate of decline of sarcopenia?
When you've done it at a younger age, so prior to becoming a master.
Younger age. Yeah, I mean, for me, I would suspect that the greater muscle mass that you start off with, your rate of decline is maybe perhaps going to be the same if you've stopped strength training. So you're starting off with a higher baseline. And I think the same would go too with like for VO2 max too. Like the higher your VO2 max is in your 20s, the rate of decline is still going to be about 1% per year. And so it's maximizing where you are in your teen and 20-year-old ages, I think is going to be really important. But I don't know, I would say you would probably want to keep doing it, particularly if you're stopping all exercise. I think strength training is really important.
Fantastic. I'm going to do one more over here.
Hi, this is a question for Isabel. I noticed a small disclaimer about cisgender, the definition of women, females being cisgender, and also the pronouns at the end of your presentation. Does all this sort of new thing affect female research in sports?
Well, in the consensus we put together, we very specifically have a paragraph where we highlight the fact that we still need to understand a lot of the sex differences perhaps, but there is what people call a sex-gender entanglement. It's very, very difficult to know, well, what is it sex and what is the environment that we are in? So the training environment, we know that a lot of the men's sports teams have greater access to physiotherapy, the medical support and so on. So it's actually often hard to completely say it's sex or completely say it's gender. But I think we're at the point where we do need to highlight it, and it's important that we admit that our paper is on those female aspects and that there needs further work, particularly in the transgender athletes and those that have sex differences, characteristics. So we need more work. It's similar, we need more work in female specific, but we need more work more wider in that, in gender. And there is a lot now, particularly in sports injury, about taking into account that the gendered environment. It's just a very challenging area to do incredibly well. So I think it's going to take a few years for that sort of research to be published.
Great. I'm going to have to stop there just because I think the ROBA will turn the lights off if we're not careful, and I've got to make sure I fit in some thank yous before we go, but I'm sure our speakers will stick around for a few minutes afterwards if there's any more questions to follow up. So first of all, can I say a huge thank you and a round of applause to all of our speakers who've made a fantastic. And we must remember and say thank you, a huge thank you to the London Marathon who continue to support this event and make it free for us all to come here, and the venue and speaker travel, all of those things, which is long may that continue, because it's such a pleasure to be a part of this event. And I'm also really excited this year that we're actually recording these for the first time, because there's certainly a lot of content that I want to go back through at my own pace and revisit. So look out for those videos online. We're not sure exactly how long that's going to take, but it's going to be probably 2 to 3 weeks before we actually get those published. And finally, thanks to all of the people that have come to watch today and participate for the great questions, and anyone who's running the London Marathon tomorrow, best of luck, and I hope you have a good run. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.